So today we are going to be doing a little bit of a different book review. I'm going to be talking about the Introducing a Graphic Guide series. These 8 books are series 4, I believe. And so I'll talk a little bit about these books, but mostly about the graphic guide series in general. They are these short little comic book type things introducing at a very basic level ideas that are relatively complex, and so it is, I think, a really good way of approaching ideas because I think it's highly efficient. Okay? Also, there will be no ratings here because it just doesn't fit. And so the way these things work is they are maybe 200 pages, okay? And they are often discussing things that are complex, like semiotics, for example, or particle physics. Man. Inside is, it's like a comic book type thing where there's lots of images, and in some of these, a lot of text as well. And in my estimation, this leads to a couple things. So first, there's a lot of pictures, and so if you're just thinking, and the pages aren't that big, so if you're just thinking of it in terms of how long is it actually, it's probably like 60 or 70 pages. What it would be like in a normal book. But I think that when you introduce the pictures, you actually can learn faster. So like if you're learning about Einstein in the case of particle physics, and there's a picture of Einstein, I think you actually learn the material on Einstein better, and you are better at differentiating something between like Einstein's ideas and like Max Weber, I think is another physicist. And so I think these images help out a lot, especially when there's like graphic, like, what do I want to say? Like models, like Venn diagrams, like these sorts of things can really help out with the learning process. And so I consider these highly efficient. So on a minute-by-minute basis, I think when you are looking at something that has a lot of pictures, and some of these have a lot of text as well, like this has a lot of text, you know, you learn faster. And the second thing is, these are introductions. So they are aiming to come at you from a very basic entry level and just put in like the basics. Now they cover a lot of ground, so it's a very superficial introduction into the material, but it's at like 200 pages that reads maybe more like 100 or 70. You know, these are very quick. I can get through one of them in about like 2 hours or something like this. And so, especially if I understand the idea already, or I'm familiar with some of the background conversations on the ideas. This one specifically, particle physics, this one was hard for me because I don't know that much about physics, let alone particle physics, and so this was a bit of a slog. But what I think it does is it allows you to, you know, take a look at an idea or a thinker, do a quick overview of their material, have the overview be efficient. Because one of the problems is when you try and cover a lot of ground, I think that it can be very easy to get lost. You read one thing and then you're on to the next thing. It doesn't get reinforced, you know, and it's kind of just in one ear, out the other. I think the pictures and stuff do a lot of reinforcing and allows you to get this very superficial, broad view of something in a very quick way. And I think that, in general, when you're reading nonfiction or you're trying to acquire knowledge or you're trying to think of what thinkers you should be looking at, one of the mistakes people can tend to make is they can miss and they can decide to read a thinker that really isn't inside or consistent with like what they're actually interested in, and this is a waste of time. Or not, maybe not a waste of time, because you're still getting the exercise of reading, but it's better to be accurate. Like, it's better to read the things that you want to read, especially if you're talking technical philosophy or something like this. And so what these books can let you do is let you know if you're going to be interested in a subject. That way you can by giving you a quick and efficient overview. That way, if you want to read more on the subject, you can, and you can briefly skim over stuff quickly in a way that's efficient. Also, if you're just trying to, like, read or finish books, like, obviously it's a quick, easy read. And so, sometimes when people are looking for suggestions, they can be, it can be better to just make sure you finish a book and establish some momentum than necessarily, you know, trying to, like, if you haven't finished a book since you graduated school, you know, I would not recommend, like, an 800-page just monster. You know, it's good to start off with something you can establish some sort of momentum. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through Series 8. The first book that I already tossed on the ground was Particle Physics. I struggled through that quite a bit. Obviously, it's about particle physics. I didn't know the stuff got so small. I knew you could break atoms down into quarks and, like, but I didn't know the quarks broke down. My retention on that one in particular is pretty bad. What I did find interesting was just how massive the super colliders get. Like, several kilometers in diameter. These machines that would just shoot particles at each other, you know, trying to break them into smaller and smaller parts. Like, inside of a vacuum. So semiotics is the study of meaning, but it's meaning in the context of language. Here, I'm trying to look at, like, an exact definition on the back. Introducing semiotics outlines the development of science studies from its precursors in the ancient world via classical scholars like St. Augustine and William of Ockham to Charles Sanders Peirce. And I like this one. There's a lot of thinkers in here like Saussure and who else? Where, like, getting some of the background conversations on them is interesting. There's the sign and the signified. Derrida. Interesting. Artificial intelligence. Obviously is going to be on AI. It feels a little weird to try and summarize these books because they're, like, almost already summaries in themselves. Because, like, if you take a look at... So for this, it's quite a bit for me to try and, like, explain everything, because it's probably going to, like, cover, like, maybe 20 different thinkers and give maybe 1 to 2 pages on what they thought about it. And so I haven't fully retained all that, but just getting a brief overview of artificial intelligence. Okay, now artificial intelligence, just want to, here's what they usually do with these, is actually somewhat related to semiotics, in that there's a lot of crossover of knowledge from, you know, ability to signify things in a meaningful way, and how you're signifying things to, like, a computer. And this continues, like, Chomsky is referenced in the semiotics book. You know, his primary thing is linguistics, and perhaps less the signs. Probably the most important, like, Chomsky thing is the notion that there is a universal basic language, I think that's the term he uses, where humans all have a sort of universal language that they have at birth, and then it manifests differently depending on your, you know, how you're situated. And there's a critical age at which you have to learn language. It's like up to 5, after which you can't really learn the language. But every human is, like, built in with this ability to learn language quite well. Okay, there's also ethics, which is, shocker, about ethics. And then Foucault, who's all about prisons. Okay, that's kind of the meme on Foucault. But Foucault focuses a lot on power and how the relationship of power structures meaning. He also is important for doing, like, a lot of historical analysis. Foucault and Chomsky had a pretty famous debate, I think in the 70s, maybe the 80s. But there's a lot of like overlap in terms of like, or they're related to each other. So when you get one of these series, you know, as this is series 4, it seems that they often try and have a lot of interrelated topics, which is nice because you like are putting the puzzle pieces together. Like evolutionary psychology is has some like carryover for AI, because if you are trying to, generally speaking, AI is like the direction it's taking now is machine learning, which is done through iterative processes that refine a particular task or goal. So the machine gets better and better at accomplishing a given goal by just doing it more and more and learning. This iterative process is often related to evolutionary biology. This is evolutionary psychology, which is evolutionary biology specifically applied to psychology. And then the final one from this series is media studies, which, if you are a fan of, you know, Foucault, where's the Foucault one? There's some carryover, because a lot of the things that Foucault says about how discourses are determined by power is like echoed somewhat in terms of like just studying media and how it works. Ethics is also somewhat related to Chomsky. Chomsky was quite the he weighed in on ethical issues quite a lot, which is perhaps what he's better known for. I think the book didn't talk as much about his ethics as it did his linguistics, but this is something that's characteristic of Chomsky, and is perhaps what he's best known for in terms of public discourse. But okay, getting an overall picture of these, at the risk of like beating like the point into the ground, there is I think trying to find more efficient ways of learning stuff is really good, and these are good for that. So that's point 1. And point 2 is doing superficial examinations of a topic is a good way to decide whether the topic is worth exploring deeper. And I think that this, generally speaking, should be done in a lot of different areas where you're just kind of fishing for good ideas, and if you find like a hit, then you go in and read it more deeply. And I also think that in particular, if you think a thinker is really wrong about something, then perhaps it's also worth going in on some sort of overview of their thought, because often it can add more context, and it's important to evaluate ideas of people who you disagree with, because often it's not the case that they are just, if someone's like enormous in the like public intellectual discourse, they're probably not completely off base or completely worthless, right? But it is often easy to dismiss them, and so reading the arguments of people you disagree with, I think, is tremendously useful. And with something like this, where it's a short overview that's very efficient, this can be a good way to approach thinkers that you disagree with, without having to invest too much time or energy into it, and still giving them quite a wide and efficient like skimming, I guess, I suppose. And so, really big fan of these. They are generally in more intellectual like type areas. Like, these aren't easy topics, but they are approached in a very easy comic booky type of way. Give me 1 second. I have another stack of them. You know, these... these have been like a mainstay of like what I've approached, like how I've tried to approach learning for a bit. I think that I have either 32 or 24 of these. You know, I have one on Nietzsche, chaos, so chaos theory, psychoanalysis. Who is this related to Nietzsche, right? Because Nietzsche was one of Freud's biggest influences, and after that, Jung, right? Who obviously Freud was his biggest influence. Capitalism. I think there's in here is a Marx and a Marxism somewhere and a communism and here. Psychology, obviously related to those three psychologists. Economics, right? Obviously related to capitalism. Marxism, you see? Quantum theory. Postmodernism. And so I have another stack, but I won't. If you're interested in these, you can look at all of them, I suppose. And I want to emphasize a point that I've already made, which is that I just think that these are, you know, tremendous. As far as, let's do a little bit of a rating just for how I think of these series in general, but none of the particular one items of the series, which some of them are kind of misses, but a lot of them are hits. Some of them are just like pure text, which kind of I think misses the point, and some of them are very stylized, which I think is the point. And so I'm just going to give like a rough rating for the series or the endeavor as a whole. Okay, for utility, and this is off the cuff, so I don't already have this written down, I'd say somewhere in the neighborhood of a 9 to a 9.5. And this is largely not because, actually, a lot of the stuff covered is somewhat abstract, so maybe an 8.5. So it's a high rating. The high rating is on the back of them just being incredibly efficient, very time efficient for learning the material, but it's lowered quite a bit from like a 9.5 to like an 8.5, because a lot of the knowledge is not directly useful. It's useful insofar as it introduces you to the topic, and if you're just looking at it from that perspective, it would be like a 9 or a 9.5, something like this. For novelty, I think that a lot of these topics are not necessarily something you have to approach, or if you didn't approach them, you know, you'd be okay. And so for that perspective, it would score like lower on the novelty. However, I think the primary use of this is to introduce yourself to ideas and familiarize yourself with ideas in a quick way. And because that is one of the biggest tools for it, and which is the introduction of ideas is like kind of where novelty's at. And because you're targeting, in theory, you would want to target like stuff you want to introduce yourself to, I would score novelty maybe around a 7. Again, a lot of it is stuff that if you don't know about Jung and you never want to learn about Jung, that's like not a big deal. Okay, for entertainment, I'd give them on average a 6.5 to a 7. They are disseminating information at their core, and so there's like no narrative structure, and to this end, it's like you know, it's the project is not entertainment. The project is disseminating information, but at the same time, there's some funny things. The pictures are engaging. They make something that is like somewhat difficult like easier. So 6.5 to a 7 maybe overall. There are some where I'd score it like an 8, 7.5, and then some where it'd be like 4 or not really entertaining at all. I wasn't entertained by the particle physics one, but I wasn't super not entertained. For style, this depends quite a bit book to book. I guess on average it'd be a 6, but like a high variable 6, maybe a 6.5. Where some, like the style is like a 9, and some it's like a 4 or something. For readability, for this overall, I would give it like a 9.5. I don't think that there is a more readable way to approach these ideas at this speed and this efficiency. I just don't think it exists. I think that the introduction of so many pictures into ideas that are largely disseminated just through words only is just so incredibly readable that it's not close. This is, like, I don't give 10s, but if I were to give it 10s, you know, it would be to, like, probably some of these, not every single one of them, because, like, some of them are not as good, but, like, 9.5 for readability, or 9, I guess, on average, because some aren't going to score super high. And for interest, I think a lot of the topics covered by these books are quite interesting. This is actually going to be the most variable one in terms of ratings, because especially for every individual, like, if you're not interested in a topic, it's, like, not interesting. Overall, I'd score it like a 7. But I think every single one of these I've read has been interesting. Like, I'm into all of them. Which, I don't know, like, for an overall average that, like, would come out extremely high, but I don't rate any of the books extremely high. They're, like, kind of don't... I've never reviewed any of the books individually because they just, like, don't feel like they fit with, like, what a normal review looks like, because they're so much different. They're almost like a really big pamphlet, more so than a book. Anyways, as far as discussion goes, does anyone have ways in which they like learning or trying to learn that they think are particularly efficient, even though you don't acquire a ton of depth? So one of the shortcomings of these books is if you want to learn anything in great detail, these are not useful. I think that, well, actually, pump the brakes. I think if you wanted to learn something in detail, these would actually be really useful to make like a sort of sandwich, where you just read the short overview, then you read all the, like, filling, and then you read the short overview again. And the filling would be where a lion's share of the effort is, but that this would be a useful tool for, like, creating a sort of scaffolding on which to build, if you want to use that type of metaphor. But okay, does anyone have any sort of ways that they think are really efficient for learning that they would like to share or talk about? One that I think is, like, particularly interesting is YouTube itself, where you have this medium that is, you know, it's highly accessible. And a lot of the YouTube, like, I'm not talking about my videos, a lot of YouTube videos are just tremendous in terms of, like, they have editing and, like, cuts. Obviously, I do one cut for all my videos so far. But they have cuts and they have visual aids, and it's highly streamlined. And so, on one hand, YouTube, like, with these considerations, YouTube looks really good. And perhaps YouTube is good in the same way some of these are, just for getting, like, the surface of a thing. But YouTube does not seem engaging in the same way that, like, reading is engaging or writing is engaging, for getting into, like, the deeper type of work where I think if you are trying to understand something really well, that YouTube is not going to be your main tool. At best, it's supplementary. And at worst, there's a lot of bad information on YouTube, so at worst, it is, like, counterproductive. But yeah, if anyone has some interesting tools they think for learning, love to hear them, and do the YouTube algo stuff. And have a good day.